The young instructor's voice cut across the indoor range like a whip. "Sir, I need you to stop. That stance is completely wrong." The old man at lane 7 didn't flinch. He simply lowered his pistol, engaged the safety, and turned slowly to face the 20-something instructor with the clipboard and the crisp polo shirt bearing the Rangers logo. His weathered hands were steady. His eyes, pale blue and deeply lined, held no anger, only a patience that seemed to stretch back decades. "Wrong how?" he asked quietly. The instructor gestured at the older man's body position. His feet staggered oddly, his support arm tucked against his ribs rather than extended, his entire torso bladed at an angle that contradicted every training poster on the walls. "Sir, we teach the modern isosceles stance here. Square to the target, arms extended equally. What you're doing looks like something from the 1950s. It's inefficient and it won't serve you well in any defensive situation." The old man nodded slowly, as if considering this information for the first time. Behind them, other shooters had paused to watch. A few smirked. One younger man in tactical gear whispered something to his friend, and they both chuckled. If you believe that experience deserves respect before judgment, type honour in the comments right now. His name was Earl Witmore, and at 73 years old he had driven 40 minutes from his small ranch outside of town to this gleaming new indoor facility, because his grandson had given him a membership for Christmas. The boy meant well. He thought his grandfather might enjoy the climate-controlled lanes, the rental equipment, the professional instruction included with the premium package. What the grandson didn't fully understand was that Earl Witmore had been shooting since before the instructor's father was born, and under circumstances that no indoor range could ever replicate. Earl had served 3 tours in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group. He had been a weapons sergeant, responsible for training indigenous forces in combat marksmanship, under conditions that would make this pristine facility look like a children's playground. He had been wounded twice. The second time, in 1968, a round had passed through his left shoulder and shattered his scapula in 3 places. The surgeons saved his arm but told him he would never have full range of motion again. They were right. What they didn't tell him was that he would spend the next 5 years developing techniques to shoot effectively despite his limitations. Techniques he would later teach to other wounded soldiers at rehabilitation facilities. Techniques that would save lives in situations the young instructor couldn't imagine. But Earl said none of this. He simply stood there in his worn canvas jacket and his faded jeans, looking like exactly what the instructor saw. An old man who didn't know any better. "I appreciate the feedback," Earl said softly. "Mind if I finish my box?" The instructor hesitated, clearly torn between customer service protocols and his evident belief that he was watching dangerous incompetence. "I suppose, but I really think you should let me show you the proper fundamentals. It's included with your membership," Earl nodded politely. "Maybe after." He turned back to his lane, set his stance, that strange bladed tucked position, and began firing. The shots came in a steady, unhurried rhythm. When his magazine was empty, he set the pistol down and pressed the button to retrieve his target. The instructor, who had been watching with arms crossed, felt his expression falter as the paper came forward. The grouping was tight. Not just acceptable, exceptional. Every round had found the centre mass ring, clustered in a pattern no larger than a playing card, at 25 yards, with a stance that supposedly belonged in a museum. The instructor blinked. That's actually pretty good shooting." Earl began reloading his magazine, his movements economical and precise despite the visible stiffness in his left arm. "The position you're teaching is fine," he said, not looking up. "The isosceles is stable, good for competition, good for static range work, but it assumes something important." "What's that?" "That you haven't been shot yet." The words hung in the air. Around them, the ambient noise of the range seemed to fade. Other shooters had stopped to listen. The instructor's brow furrowed. "I'm not sure I follow." Earl finished loading and set the magazine aside. For the first time, he turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. His voice remained quiet, but it carried clearly in the sudden stillness. "You teach people to stand square to the target, both arms extended, center of mass facing the threat. It's geometrically efficient. I understand the theory, but here's what the theory doesn't account for. In an actual gunfight, there's a significant chance you're going to take a round. Maybe in the first seconds, maybe before you even get your weapon up. And when that happens, every technique you learned for a 2-armed, fully mobile standing position becomes useless." He gestured to his own stance. This position, we called it the combat crouch, though it had other names, was developed specifically for soldiers who had already been wounded. Left arm disabled or gone, mobility compromised. Maybe you're bleeding badly enough that you can't stay standing much longer. This position lets you shoot effectively with one functioning arm. It blades your body to present less target area. It tucks your wounded arm against your ribs so it's not hanging out getting hit again. And it lowers your center of gravity, so if you're about to collapse, you have less distance to fall and you can keep shooting on the way down. The instructor opened his mouth, then closed it. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side. Earl continued, his tone that of a teacher rather than a critic. The modern shooting world has gotten very good at optimizing for perfect conditions. Fresh shooter, no injuries, good lighting, stationary target, no incoming fire. That's important. You need the fundamentals. But there's a whole body of knowledge that's been largely forgotten, developed by men who had to solve a different problem. How do you stay in the fight when everything has already gone wrong? One of the younger shooters, the one in tactical gear who had smirked earlier, stepped forward. His expression had changed entirely. Where did you learn this? Earl was quiet for a moment. Vietnam. After my second wound, I spent 8 months at a rehabilitation center in Japan. My shoulder was destroyed. Doctors said I'd never shoot again. But I was a weapons sergeant. Shooting was my job, so I started experimenting. Found positions that worked with one arm, with limited mobility, with compromised balance. When I got back to the States, they had me help train other wounded soldiers, men missing limbs, men with nerve damage, men who everyone said would never hold a weapon again. He paused, and something shifted in his pale eyes, a memory surfacing perhaps of faces long gone. Some of those men went back into combat. Some of them made it home because of techniques they learned in that program, not because the techniques were perfect, because they were designed for imperfect situations. The range had gone completely silent now. The instructor, whose name tag read Kyle, set his clipboard on a nearby bench and approached Earl with a different energy entirely. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on appearances." Earl shook his head. "You taught what you were trained to teach. Nothing wrong with that. But maybe consider that when an old-timer does something unusual, there might be a reason for it. Might even be worth asking before correcting." Kyle nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by extending his hand. "Would you be willing to show me more? I've never seen these techniques, and I've been through 3 different instructor certification programs." Earl looked at the hand, then at the young man's face. He saw something there. Genuine humility, genuine curiosity. The same expression he had seen on countless young soldiers decades ago, men who understood they were about to learn something no manual could teach. "I'd be happy to," Earl said, taking the hand. "But let's do it properly. Mind if I bring some materials next time? I kept the old training documents. Wrote most of them myself." What followed over the next several months transformed that gleaming indoor range in ways no one anticipated. Earl returned every Thursday afternoon, and word spread quickly through the local shooting community. His sessions, informal at first, then organised into actual classes with the range owner's enthusiastic blessing, drew not just curious hobbyists, but law enforcement officers, military veterans, and even a few physical therapists who worked with injured patients. He taught the combat crouch and its variations. He demonstrated one-handed malfunction clearances. He showed how to reload from a seated position, how to shoot while moving to cover when one leg wouldn't bear weight, how to maintain accuracy when blood loss was making your vision narrow and your hands shake. And he explained the history, how these techniques had evolved through brutal necessity and conflicts most of the students were too young to remember, how they had been refined in rehabilitation centres and VA hospitals by men who refused to accept that their fighting days were over. But perhaps more importantly, Earl taught a philosophy. The goal isn't to master every technique, he would tell his growing classes. The goal is to understand that techniques exist for situations you hope you never face. The man who only knows how to shoot under perfect conditions is prepared for a very narrow slice of reality. The man who has thought about what happens when things go wrong, he's prepared for the world as it actually is. Kyle, the young instructor who had first criticised Earl's stance, became his most dedicated student. Within a year, he had incorporated modified shooting positions into the ranger's curriculum, the first facility in the state to do so. He credited Earl in every class, every certification, every interview. I almost dismissed him because he didn't match my picture of what an expert looks like. Kyle told a local news crew that came to cover the program. "Biggest mistake I nearly made in my career. Now I make sure to ask questions before I make assumptions. That lesson alone was worth more than any certification I've earned." Earl Witmore continued teaching until the week before his death, 3 years after that first confrontation at Lane 7. His final class was on a Thursday afternoon, a session on seated shooting positions for a group that included 2 wounded veterans from recent conflicts. He showed them the techniques he had developed half a century ago, techniques that had travelled from the jungles of Vietnam to a rehabilitation centre in Japan to a small ranch in the American heartland to this moment, passing from one generation of warriors to the next. When he finished, one of the young veterans, a sergeant who had lost his left leg in Afghanistan, approached him. "I thought I'd never shoot again," the sergeant said, his voice rough. "My therapist sent me here hoping it would help with my adjustment. I didn't expect—" He stopped, struggling for words. Earl put a hand on the young man's shoulder, his right hand the one that still worked properly. "You're going to be fine," he said. "You're going to be more than fine. You've got something now that most shooters never develop. You've learned to adapt. That skill transfers to everything." Today, that range offers a program named after Earl Witmore, specifically designed for wounded veterans and disabled shooters. The waiting list is 6 months long. The techniques he resurrected from near obscurity are now taught at facilities across the country. And on the wall of Lane 7, his lane, hangs a simple plaque with a quote from his final interview. "A technique is only wrong if it doesn't work. Everything else is just preference dressed up as principle." The next time you see someone doing something differently than you were taught, consider pausing before you correct them. Consider asking why. Consider that behind every unusual method there might be a story, a history, a hard-won piece of wisdom that the conventional approach never had to learn. Because the men who developed these techniques didn't have the luxury of perfect conditions. They had missing limbs and shattered bones and blood on the floor and rounds still incoming, and they figured out how to fight anyway. That's not a deviation from proper training. That's training for the world as it actually is. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that respect should come before judgment, and that the lessons of those who fought and bled should never be forgotten.